Giuquit, hello. Welcome to the podcast series of the Center for Irish Studies at Villanova University. My name is Joseph Lennon, Emily C. Riley, Director of the Center.
And I'm Jennifer Joyce, Associate Director and Curator of this series. We appreciate the support from our many donors, especially a generous grant from the Connolly Foundation.
This podcast series aims to reflect aspects of Irish studies through the 9 different academic disciplines that are taught through Villanova's Center for Irish Studies. Our faculty and students will engage in discussions with distinguished thinkers, artists, writers, academics, political leaders, and other campus visitors.
We are very excited for our second season of this podcast. Our episodes this year explore current issues about race and dive into traditional song and story. Thank you so much for listening. And if you are looking for more Irish Studies events, please join us virtually this year for a rich menu of programming. You can follow us on social media, find us at our website, or email us at irishstudies@villanova.edu. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to stand over here on the side, so hopefully you can see me just for a few minutes as we do our introductions. I'm Dr. Jennifer Joyce. I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Irish Studies here at Villanova, and I'd like to welcome you to our final Heimbold Chair event of the semester, a conversation with Dr. Kimberly McLean DaCosta, and the 2022 Heimbold Chair, Emma Dabiri. So thank you all for being here. We're so thrilled to have you here in person. It's wonderful to be back together again, having live events. I'd also like to give a warm thanks to Falvey Memorial Library for co-sponsoring this event, and especially to librarian Gina Duffy and her team for all of her hard work in helping to organize and advertise. I'd also like to thank Kirsten Ludi and Dr. Joseph Lennon and the Center for Irish Studies for their support in this as well. So just a few quick announcements before I introduce my esteemed colleagues. If you are a major or minor or are currently in an Irish Studies course, you have the incredible opportunity to meet the Irish Ambassador to the United States, Daniel Mulhall, this Thursday on campus at 4:30 in the St. Rita's Community Room. So you can just show up, or you can RSVP to Irish Studies at villanova.edu. We also have a save the date for our students for the end of the year celebration, and that's Thursday, April 28th from 4 to 6 p.m. in the Gary Courtyard. So more to follow on that, but you want to kind of hold that date. The Belfast Writing Through Conflict course is running this fall. This is an embedded course where students get to travel over fall break to Belfast to study with alongside Irish authors in the Seamus Heaney Center. So you can contact the Office of Education Abroad, Irish Studies, or Dr. Alan Drew in the English department for more information. And lastly, we have a few exciting events remaining this semester, including one with harpist and Fulbright scholar Mary O'Donnell on April 20th, and a virtual one on the centenary of James Joyce's Ulysses on April 26th. So if you're not receiving our electronic newsletter, please sign up on our Center for Irish Studies homepage. So the format for tonight's program is quite simple. Our 2 presenters plan to talk with one another on various topics for about 30 minutes, and then I will open it up to audience questions. So tonight's conversation will also be converted into an Irish Studies podcast episode, so you can stay tuned. It will be on all of our major platforms. So without further ado, this evening I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Kimberly McLean DaCosta, sociologist at NYU, and Emma Dabiri, the 2022 Villanova University Charles A. Heimbold Chair for Irish Studies. Born and raised in Boston, in 2 of its suburbs, both largely white and blue collar, Dr. Kim DaCosta is the 4th of her Irish mother and African-American father's 6 children. The experience of growing up in metropolitan Boston in the 70s and 80s, a time and place uncomfortable with, when not outright hostile to interracial families, first sparked her academic interests. She's especially attentive to the contemporary production of racial boundaries. Dr. DaCosta's book, Making Multiracials, State, Family, and Market in the Redrawing of the Color Line, explores the cultural and social underpinnings of the movement to create multiracial collective identity in the United States, and is based on interviews and fieldwork with members of organizations for interracial families and people of mixed descent. She is currently writing on how interracial extended kin relationships speak to questions of interracial empathy, interracial empathy, care, and politics, and teaches courses on race in different societies, social mobility, consumerism, and the commercialization of intimate life. And since I'm sure tonight won't be enough, nearly enough, you can hear even more about these questions on our Irish Studies podcast. This is the season 3, episode 1, where Dr. Joseph Lennon chats with Kim about these compelling topics. Dr. DaCosta graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University and holds a PhD in sociology from Berkeley. She has served as Associate Dean of Students at NYU's Gallatin School and has been involved in NYU's prison education program since its inception in 2013. Kim is an associate faculty member in the NYU Department of Sociology and the mother of 3 children, and we are delighted that she could get away from New York to be here with us in person tonight. And now I'd like to introduce our 2022 Heimbold Chair in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, writer and broadcaster Emma Dabiri. The Charles A. Heimbold Chair of Irish Studies, inaugurated in 2000 at Villanova, has become one of the most prestigious Irish Studies positions in the United States. The Visiting Writer in Residence program offers Irish Studies students the enriching experience of close classroom learning from one of Ireland's finest authors. Former Heimbold chairs include luminaries from the Irish literary arts, including Owen McCafferty, Marina Carr, Sebastian Barry, Claire Keegan, Glenn Patterson, Eamon Wall, Mike McCormick, Hannah Khalil, and Morris Fitzpatrick. The Center for Irish Studies is so pleased to have Emma and her family living here in Rosemont during this Heimbold post. Emma's partner, Ian McQuaid, is an artist in his own right, the head of A&R for Moves Recordings in London, scouting and producing game-changing musical artists of rap, Afrobeats, drill, R&B, and beyond. We are also very excited to welcome Ian and Emma's 2-year-old son, Io, and 9-year-old son, Remy, whose imagination and joyful spirits are unmatched. We will be very sad to see them go. Emma and Ian live in the UK, but Emma Dabiri was born in Dublin to an Irish mother who was herself born in Trinidad and a Nigerian Yoruba father. Emma's identification and experience as a person of color in a homogenous Ireland forms her writing, research, and academic teaching focus in African studies and visual sociology, as well as in the arts, fashion, and the media. Dabiri is a regular host on YouTube Originals Virtual History and BBC Radio 4's Saturday Review and Front Row. She also co-presents the BBC Britain's Lost Masterpieces and has presented numerous documentaries on both BBC TV and radio. I personally was very excited last fall to learn that the only approved public event by Sally Rooney to discuss her latest novel was a live interview by Emma Dabiri. And some of my colleagues and I streamed it with excitement, knowing that Emma would soon be coming to Villanova. In addition to being a BBC broadcaster, Emma Dabiri has written 2 best-selling nonfiction books, Twisted, which came out in 2020 by Harper Perennial, published in Ireland as Don't Touch My Hair, and What White People Can Do Next, 2021, also by Harper. These books are incredibly crucial to conversations around race, and Villanova students are telling me how resonant they are with the cultural moment, particularly in the United States. The Irish Times describes What White People Can Do Next as fascinating and invigorating, a book for everyone. Time magazine praises it as a manifesto for radical change in a world impacted by the pandemic and the surge of attention on Black Lives Matter. Both books are for sale at the table over here in the back. Interested in the Black Irish experience, histories of oppression, racialized identity in Irish language, and Irish embodied practices, Emma is completing her doctorate at Goldsmiths University, London. She also joined us at the Villanova University's Creative Acts Symposium in Monaco in the fall, where she discussed creative arts' influence on Irish narratives and diversity. Both of our esteemed guests share scholarly and personal interest in processes of racialization, interracial empathy, politics, and Irish identity. And we are in for a treat tonight as they converse. So please help me welcome Dr. Kim McLean DaCosta and the 2022 Heimbold Chair, Emma Dabbery.
Thank you. Welcome. Should we use both of these?
Yes, we're on. Thank you for your generous introduction, Jenny. And the shout out for my family who are not here, but I'm sure they would have appreciated their inclusion.
Yeah, I'm wishing they were here after that.
It wouldn't be a calm, experience. One of them is two.
Well, before we start, I feel I should say our condolences. Sorry for your loss. Glad we're here tonight. Respect for the team that got as far as they did. So it's really, really nice to be here. And it's a real treat for me to be able to talk to Emma in person because, I became aware of your work through your public writings, newspapers, and then obviously reading your books. And so, and this isn't an interview of you, but it is a chance for, I think, both of us to kind of think about the ways that our work maybe overlaps. I think one of the things that I'm so interested in as a mixed-race Irish American who's been really looked to Ireland of late to see the rapid demographic changes happening in the last 2 decades, how that's impacting how Irish people talk and speak about race in maybe ways that are unfamiliar to them or awkward, or all the, things that people have to get used to in a context in which demographics change rapidly. But, as I've talked to Joseph about before, what really fascinated me is, post George Floyd, when Black Irish on Instagram, Black people in Ireland were coalescing around that, not just that hashtag, but a kind of a sense that one needed to be able to articulate what it felt like to be Black in Ireland now. And what was really sort of fascinating for me from my position here is how much the ways that Leon and others who started that group talked about their experience in Ireland sounded just like my experience in Boston in the 70s and the 80s, particularly in a very Irish context. So, and you've been in that space in Ireland as a child. So we have different kind of experiences as Black Irish people, different national contexts, and finding what is sort of useful about elaborating that and comparing seems to me to be, I hope, a fruitful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think for me, growing up in an Ireland that was very different to the Ireland that you were describing. And I think that the changes that have happened in Ireland since the late 90s, when there started to be not mass immigration, but there started to be immigration of people from Africa and Asia and other parts of the world where people aren't white to Ireland in any significant number for the first time. Of course, there'd been migration before, like my Nigerian grandfather had moved to Ireland in the 1940s to study in Trinity. And I was actually surprised to discover that there had been like a small community of Nigerian students there then. But they hadn't been migrants. They were all people that were going back to where they came from, these newly independent African countries. But the country that I grew up in was like 99.9% white. And then around the time I left, in 1998, we're beginning to see like that a demographic change happening. But I think it's the children of those people who were coming in the 90s who have now, it's that generation who've now come of age. And there are a lot of the young Black Irish people who were coalescing around the groups like Black and Irish, and that we saw after the events of 2020 have this kind of visible public expression of Black Irishness that I don't think has ever happened before. So it was a really interesting moment. But as I said, when I was growing up, it was very different to that. So I actually, even though I was born in Ireland, I spent like the first few years of my life in Atlanta in like an entirely Black environment, with the exception of my mother. But then moving back to Ireland was a huge shock to the system. But I very much look to America, I think, because of those early formative years. But also, I felt like I was just fascinated by Black American history. And even though the Irish aspect wasn't pronounced at all, I felt like the only place in the world where there are people that are really the same ethnicity as me is in the Caribbean and in America, because there are people who are of West African ancestry and to varying degrees also often of Irish ancestry, even though that isn't really acknowledged. I know it's a fact. So in a way, I felt very drawn to a part of the world that was like very far from where I was, but I felt there was like some sort of kinship or familiarity. Whereas like in Ireland, like there weren't really any other Black people. And even in Nigeria, I was always my first degree was in like African studies with a focus on the Yoruba and Nigeria. But even there, I was like, well, everybody is Yoruba, but it's only in the diaspora, in the Caribbean and in the States that there are people to some degree that are kind of like me.
I loved that when I read that in your writing, because it struck me as so interesting, because it's not how African Americans conceive of themselves.
I know, and I knew that.
Yeah, and so to the extent that as a Black mixed race woman here, asserting one's Irishness in some ways had nowhere to go.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
it was sort of like because African Americans tend, despite the fact that we know most African Americans have non-African ancestors, the source of that, the particulars of it might not be known in terms of individuals. There's a general sense that it comes out of a legacy of slavery. But the specificity of Irishness is not something that's been elaborated on until relatively recently, for a variety of reasons that maybe we can talk about. But it struck me as so interesting that you had as a child that imaginative identification, even as when I was a child, it was like there was just nowhere for that to be even to resonate in any historical sense. It was if we were sort of one-offs.
Yeah, completely. And like that really resonates with me as well, in that I, in many ways, like suppressed my Irishness or downplayed my Irishness for multiple reasons. First of all, because there was like a profound rejection of my Irishness in Ireland. And I was like so consistently told that, you're not really Irish, that I was like, you know what, like if they're going to keep telling me that I'm not Irish, like, hey, font grand, like, I'm not Irish, that's cool, like, we're not going to beg to be Irish. And then so there was that. But then I also, because I was very strongly identified as Black in Ireland, so even when Jenny is saying, oh, person of colour in Ireland, there was no terminology like that. It was just like the Black girl, if people were being polite. There were other descriptions when people were being less polite. so I like had a very pronounced sense of myself as Black, and then I actually didn't see any way of accommodating Blackness and Irishness. So I was like, oh, the Irishness makes me like a lot less Black. So when I left, oh my God, like I won't even go into some of the strategies that I use to try and like pretend not to be Irish. It's kind of embarrassing to think about now. I could change my lots of things. But yeah, I totally felt like there wasn't that space to kind of be both. And one was very denied to me, and the other felt like a lot more like welcoming. And I was just like, oh, that's, yeah, it felt like there had to be this kind of choice, you know, that you couldn't be both. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then also something I wanted to talk about as well is I've been reading a lot about Nella Larsen recently, because we were looking at Quicksand in one of my classes that actually looks at parallels between like between the Irish literary revival and the Harlem Renaissance. And I was reading a biography of Nella Larsen, and it was talking about the fact that this happened to her, but it's also like a theme in Quicksand, which is quite autobiographical, where Helga Crane and both Nella Larsen are, you know, kind of elevated to a degree in the Black community because of colorism and because of their complexion and their hair texture in both the book and in Nella Larsen's life. But to actually so the result of having a white parent is physically something that has a status attached to it. Yet, and there's a scene where this is explored in Quicksand, but the actual fact of having a white parent is something that is really stigmatized. And when she tries to talk about it, people are like, it's a taboo. You know, people are like, we don't talk about that.
Right.
You know, so there is this kind of paradox there as well.
Absolutely. This strange duality where the reality of colorism is such that, depending on your phenotype, you get a certain kind of admiration is probably not quite the right term, but people don't want to hear about your white mother.
Why you look like, yeah, so it's like the mixing, I guess, has to be further back and intergenerational maybe than having a straight up white parent.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So, you know, given what you've seen go on, change in Ireland, that sort of in some ways brings us to this place of reflection. What is it like for you now to go to Ireland? Because there's a way that this new discourse about Blackness in Ireland is, you tell me, is it taking a kind of shape that can fully encompass the recent past of which you were a part, in terms of race in Ireland? Or is it something else, and maybe we shouldn't be analogizing too strongly between past, present, and U.S.?
So is the question? Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Well, when you see, you know, Black Irish presenters on TV, when you see more attention paid to the experience of either recent immigrants of African descent or young people born and raised in Ireland,
Yeah.
who aren't mixed race, or maybe, is it do you have a sense that it is creating a kind of politics that speaks to the issues, say, that you see as important right now?
Okay, so I would say like the mainstream kind of a brand of anti-racism that my book is. So what white people can do next. The title is misleading. It is a critique of it's kind of a critique of mainstream liberal anti-racist discourse but it's presenting itself as that. It's presenting itself as a self-help book for white people. It just has been published in Germany, and I was doing the German press today, and one of the guys interviewing me was like, "You've basically written like a black Marxist text, but it's been like a bestseller. Like, how did you do that?" And I was like, "Well, because I have disguised it as a self-help book for white people." And that genre is very popular. So, so I feel that a lot of the expression, like a lot of the way anti-racism is approached in Ireland is just kind of cut and paste from what's happening in the US, even though it's an entirely different context and history, and it's not like living in the aftermath of like with the legacy of slavery, and there's a big difference between being the descendants of slaves and being like a recent African migrant. But those nuances are not, they're not even nuances, those glaring disparities are sometimes eluded. So I would say a lot of it is very much like the emphasis is on the same, is on that kind of like liberal mainstream brand of anti-racism, that its major concerns seem to be the tackling of microaggressions, like implicit bias and more representation. But I think in Ireland, there's not the same embedded, institutionalized, structural racism that would exist here, or would even exist in the UK. It's to a lesser extent than here, because the history of the black community that's in Britain now has a much shorter history than the black community that's here. It's like a post-war immigrant community. But yeah, I feel like Ireland has there's an opportunity in that kind of structural, institutionalized racism isn't entrenched and embedded in the same way as it is in other parts of the world. So I feel like, the responses, I think, just need to be geographically specific to what's happening, to the context of Ireland, rather than just, cut and paste from here.
So what is anti-racism?
Well, this is going to be a hard question.
That's the wrong question. But because it speaks to the kind of politics that are emerging, right? It seems to me from a distance, tell me if I'm wrong, but what people, say through Black and Irish, are asking for or articulating is, one, the various forms of prejudice that they did and do experience in everyday interactions. The depth of it, these are people explaining their own experience.
Yeah, and actually to respond to that, so most of the, I don't know, I had thought that most of the experiences I had of racism in Ireland were on the interpersonal level, and that is not to in any way diminish them, because they were so defining of my experiences growing up there that I left. As soon as I finished school, I was just I'm not staying here. There's other parts of that I can live in many other places and not be the black girl in the way that I was there, with all the attendant things, negative connotations that people associated with that. But then actually, when I was researching Don't Touch My Hair, I did come across more, in the research, I did come across references to colored children, and they were children who were they had African student fathers and then white Irish mothers, and they were children that were in institutions, in industrial schools. And there is evidence of institutionalized racism. It's just that the numbers are so small. So it's not to say, you'd hear this thing, there's no racism here. And I'd be like, well, there's no one to be racist against except me. I'm getting loads of it, So I think because the notion of whiteness, because Irish people had been taught to perceive of themselves as white and to understand themselves as white with the belief in an inherent superiority that comes with those processes of racialization of whiteness, the possibility for racism was completely there and expressed itself when it got the opportunity. It didn't necessarily get the opportunity all that often. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So, as I'm sure you're aware, there's an ongoing debate. I'm not sure how robust it is still, but of the questions about Irish Americans and at what point the Irish became white. So I recently did a talk on how the Irish became black, and it was an attempt to sort of think through the lens of these genealogical rediscoveries, to kind of shine a light on the ways in which blacks and Irish have intermingled for centuries. But also to kind of explain how it is that, say, those people that you're identifying with who are like you in important ways as a child came to be, the various routes through which different waves of Irish immigration into the American South or the North had different patterns of interaction with blacks. But one of the fallouts from the framing how the Irish became white is a fierce debate about whether or not the Irish were white on arrival, as someone like Kevin Kenny would say, or Jim Carroll, or the extent to which the kind of shared low status position of Irish Americans and African Americans is something that gets resurrected in contemporary politics when you start asking people to really think about the ways that they are refusing to deal with their own racial prejudice or discriminatory behavior against blacks. And I wonder if there's a similar kind of resistance to talking about race in Ireland, or what you're observing there.
So I don't live in Ireland, so it's like I'm in the UK, which is very close by, and I spend a lot of time in Ireland, but I'm aware that it's different to, go back for like a week, even though I go back really regularly, but that's still completely different to being like really embedded in the institutions and my children going to school there and all of that stuff. And I think the kind of the everyday racism was so ubiquitous that I can't imagine it's just stopped. However, I am really happy to witness and to be part of the level of commitment that I see from Irish institutions and just generally from most people. Of course, there are exceptions, but to really kind of do the work of making Ireland like an inclusive country. And something that I notice as a distinct difference between the UK and Ireland is I will see a lot of Black Irish people who, again, are not mixed. They will have two Black parents. They don't have an Irish parent. Describe themselves as Irish in a way that you would not see somebody that had two Black parents in England be like, hey, I'm English. That just doesn't happen. At most, they might identify as Black British, but that's very distinct from being English. So I think that's an interesting difference. And I think there is, when I used to say, it was just there was just no scope for understanding that somebody could be Black and Irish. Not just actually with Irish people, with everybody. People just be like, what? Everyone. But I think certainly in Ireland, I think it still surprises people outside of Ireland, but I think in Ireland that really seems to have changed. It kind of almost seems unremarkable to be Black and Irish. And in Ireland, I'm not saying that's the case here. When I tell people I'm Irish here, they still are often surprised. And similarly in England as well, like people often can't get their head around it.
Yeah. As you're talking, you're reminding me of the sort of different perceptions from, across the Atlantic. Because I'm remembering my parents when they would go to Ireland, how much they loved it there. Mm-hmm. And their perception of what was so wonderful about Ireland was that it didn't have the racial prejudice of the U.S. Right? Now, of course, they're American tourists, essentially.
Yeah.
But it was really impactful and really moving, and they loved it there for that reason. The sense that they were welcome. Mm-hmm. And so it fundamentally shifted. It creates an image, right, in the head, a place of receptivity, a place
Land of 1,000 welcomes.
Exactly. That has all the more resonance because they didn't get it here.
Yeah, that is really interesting to me, and I think unsurprising for two reasons. First of all, being that something I mentioned in What White People Can Do Next. I don't draw too much on my personal experience, but I do have small anecdotes. And I talk about how the distance that I might have felt between my white friends and peers and family even in Ireland, actually when I came to America became something that was more the kind of segregation that exists here, the spatial segregation that exists here doesn't exist in Ireland in that way, So every time I'd come to the States, I had just come as a teenager, I just go to Atlanta and my whole family is Black and I just be in a really Black place and I just actually wouldn't really encounter any white people. And then once I came to America with my Irish school friends and an Irish boyfriend. And we didn't go to Atlanta, we went to Boston, we went to New York, we went to Ocean City. And it was like I was in a different country and I left, I went home early. I did not have a good time. And it was just it was a very different experience. So I think that would probably to your parents, that kind of, I guess, the kind of spatial segregation that exists would be refreshing, I guess, not to experience. But also the reception in Ireland, that makes me think of my grandfather, my grandparents, and my dad and his siblings living in Ireland in the early 1950s and having a lovely time, because a very different experience to what I had. And I think that is in large part because, first of all, they weren't immigrants. First of all, they were in a very privileged, international student kind of bubble. So they lived in quite a rarefied world and they were going home. They were just visitors who were leaving. Whereas someone like me was actually Irish. And I think that was threatening, because people would be like, where are you from? I'd be like, from Ireland. And that was the problem. That was the problem. They wanted me to be American or to be British and to just be there visiting. They didn't want me to be that's why the book, well, you're not really Irish. Come on, you can't be Irish. So I think it's that thing of being a visitor. If you're a Black visitor, then there's a glamour and excitement and you're leaving and you're not troubling notions of Irishness. I don't think this is the case anymore either. I'm speaking about, I guess, maybe your parents' experience or my experience when I was younger. So I think that might have to do with it as well.
Yeah. You've mentioned a lot that's different about Ireland and the U.S. with respect to race, and in particular the various forms of racial domination that exist here, that change over time, but prejudicial beliefs, they change. And they have changed significantly, particularly around race. discriminatory behavior, but especially segregation. So the kinds of spatial segregation we have here are in large part connected to the reproduction of racial inequality, what some people will describe as systemic racism. I think it's a bad term. But
Could you elaborate? I also think it's a bad term, but I want to hear why you think it's a bad term.
well, because the term racism itself is too unspecific. It implies what? Is it attitude? Is it behavior? Is it these mystical, magical qualities that somehow reproduce themselves? It gets talked about in that way when you say systemic racism. People aren't really clear about the mechanism by which it reproduces itself. And if you can't be specific about that, you can't also be specific about how it changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you can have inequality reproduced along racially categorized lines, but it might not be because people have animus toward each other. It might not even because they're discriminating actively against a group on the basis of race. It might be because they're in shitty schools. It's the neighborhoods and the way we fund them, right? So that's why the term is not helpful. It's not an analytical term. It's become a kind of political watchword that doesn't really help us understand. But to the extent that that is different, you don't have segregation in Ireland in this way, but the class profile of people according to the ways that they're racialized is also different. But I guess I wonder about that because in your book, What White People Can Do Next, you're really clear about a critique of whiteness as such. Isn't that helpful insofar as it stays about shame or guilt? Or what does this do? But you're really nudging people toward a kind of critique of capitalism. And in that sense, a class analysis, which is about thinking about redistribution. I guess I'd like to hear you say more about what you think that looks like, either here or in Ireland or UK or any place that you feel.
Yeah, sure. So I think the set of priorities that emerges from understanding racism as just these interpersonal exchanges is, keeping everything located in that sphere of the interpersonal and the whole thing of like checking your privilege. When I first encountered the concept of white privilege, I was just like, oh, this has like a lot of utility. It's like naming this thing that like is unnamed, and this is really useful. But like in the years since then, it's kind of become untethered, I think, from that, and it's just applied in this way that often doesn't like acknowledge the structural differences that exist amongst people who are racialized as white. But I also feel that like the language of allyship, and that's why the book is called What White People Can Do Next, From Allyship to Coalition, it frames the demand or the appeal as in a particular way that I find like not only like deeply problematic, but also like extremely unstrategic and incapable of doing what it like proposes to do. And it's also like this form of anti-racism that we're all like reproducing, but that actually has its origins in this kind of like self-help literature for white people to basically be nicer, essentially. And there's completely other different, like, it's also, even though there's a lot of people who are racialized as black who are proponents of this form of anti-racism, it's like a kind of a white liberal anti-racism. And there's this whole entire like black radical tradition that is just approaching these issues from like a very different place and has a completely different set of demands. And the connection with that tradition just seems to be lost in a lot of the like social media discourse and the discourse that is produced kind of like from that space. And I think, like, maybe in summary, it's like the move from having redistributive. So if you look at the Black organizing of the 60s and 70s, the demands are redistributive. You know, it's actually about redistributing resources. And the demands now are mostly representational. It's about more representation and inclusion in a system that not only doesn't work, but is actually destroying the world.
So Adolf Reed has a really, I think, trenchant critique of this, and he describes this form of racial politics, and those who advocate it, you mentioned that it's not just white liberals who are advocating this, it's many Black people or people of color. Mm-hmm. He says it's not a racial politics they're advocating, it's a class politics disguised as racial politics.
Yes.
It's a class politics of the upper middle class, of the professional managerial class. Mm-hmm. In other words, this actually doesn't disturb anything, but it is a justification for representation in all sorts of domains. But representation really just allows more people of different hues on different aspects of an unequal hierarchy. Mm-hmm. It's not challenging that hierarchy itself. And I think that's a pretty on-point critique. Because as you say, this question of coalition implies something about redistribution, mm-hmm. about challenging the conditions that make, in a distorted way, thinking of the world in racial terms, a mode through which one can feel better about the self, but not really change anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that it makes me think of like Fanon, you know, where he's saying he doesn't. It's like it's calling not just for the end of colonialism, but for the end of a world in which like colonialism makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think things like you know the what's just been happening in the last few days with the Amazon workers, yes. And like Chris Smalls, really tapping into that like tradition of strategic organizing rather than a cataloging of kind of microaggressions and like interpersonal and like personal privilege, is a really exciting development.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Actually, I wanted to talk about this because it seemed to me like we're not talking about this enough.
Oh yeah, I know, but we're talking about the slap.
Oh, Pierre. Oh, you should mention it.
Yeah, so the slap like broke me. Not the slap itself, the furore, the fallout following the slap, and it obscured the fact that like this on the same night, Jay-Z like had this party where he was the I can't remember the name of the place where he had the party, but this very exclusive.
The Marmont Chateau.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Very exclusive hotel in Los Angeles, I guess. Yeah, Hollywood. Yeah. Hollywood. And he was basically, it's being boycotted by like Black and brown workers who are protesting racial discrimination and sexual harassment. And they asked him not to have his party there, and he still had it there. And not only did he have the party, but the party was packed to the rafters of like A-list celebrities, many of whom, you know, are being held up as we're celebrating the representation, their recent casting in films that are wins for representation and inclusion and diversity. When it comes to actually representing or supporting the demands of like, you know, a Black working class, there wasn't much evidence of solidarity or interest, and that just nobody was talking about that. Everybody was just talking about like Will Smith and Jada and her hair and all of these things. And again, it just showed that like it seems like the set of priorities just seem like I'm saying, like kind of focused on representation and celebrities rather than, you know, kind of the working class and the organizing that they're doing to try and like transform things.
Is it That coalition isn't sexy?
Oh, coalition. It's not that coalition isn't sexy. I just think no one's really like proposing it. Like, you know, I think, maybe being like a hotel worker isn't like, I don't know, it's not aspirational enough. Like, you know, it's not who everyone wants to be Beyonce, you know. Not the person cleaning up at her party, I guess. So yeah, and I just thought in the context of like Jay-Z and Beyonce's like increasingly like pro-black rhetoric, it was just an interesting contradiction. So I've written a piece about it that's going to be like published tomorrow morning, and it's being published in the UK while I'm still asleep, and I feel like I'm just going to wake up to like like so much controversy. But I watched the last episode of Atlanta. I don't know if anyone's seen it. Oh my God, like it is talking about so much that I think that is in the book. Like they're in London and they're talking about like people that are scamming kind of anti-racism. They're also talking about like kind of white liberals, like manufactured outrage at like things that lots of black people don't actually care about on these people's behalf. And I watched that episode and it actually just gave me the confidence to like press send on the piece. I was just like, okay, Glover's talking about this stuff. I'm like, safe. I sent it. And yeah.
Maybe this is a great segue for us to continue the conversation, but open it up to the audience, because it's been fascinating. Who has questions? And we can kind of keep hearing from our presenters. We have, maybe I can take it. Yeah, thanks. Happy to. Comments, questions?
Thank you. Yeah, you said that, you know, when you left Ireland and you went to, I think it was the Caribbean, you said, and you felt like...
Oh no, I went to London. Sadly, I didn't go to the Caribbean.
You mentioned something about, like, you feel like that was, like, you felt more at home with those people.
Oh, yeah. I have gone to the, like, whenever I go to the Caribbean, people are like, are you home? And I'm like, oh my God, I've never even been to this island before. But it's like, yeah, exciting to be, like, claimed by somewhere you've never been when you're rejected in the place.
Yeah, and you said you felt rejected. Was there a time or experience when you thought to yourself, like, I want to explore that heritage a little more and kind of...
Oh yeah,
did something specific happen, or you just?
Yeah, completely, absolutely. Like I left Ireland, moved to England, and it was only like in leaving Ireland that I realised, like, irrespective of what anyone said about me or any gatekeeping, like I was just like really Irish, like that my cultural, like my sensibilities and my outlook and lots of things about like my worldview were Irish, but I hadn't really realized that until I left. There were lots of things that when I was living somewhere else, there were lots of things I identified about myself that I had thought were just normal, that living in another culture, I realized were very Irish. But I still wasn't like ready to kind of like claim or engage with that. And I that still wasn't even necessarily really an option. But you know what? Another turning point was in 2016. I wrote a piece for The Guardian, actually English newspaper, called "I'm Irish, but I'm not white. Why is that still an issue 100 years after the Easter Rising?" Because it was the commemoration of the Easter Rising. And in that, I wrote about I really love like Irish like folk music, and I was like just referencing like a lot of music and how like Ireland was presented in a certain way, and the kind of the aims of some of the revolutionaries of 2016, the ones that I'm particularly into, like James Connolly and stuff, and how different the Ireland that emerged was kind of like from his vision. And that got like syndicated and published in the Irish Times. And the response to that from Ireland, from Irish people, was like, I was just like, wow, the country has really changed. Like something is going on. Like off the back of that, people started inviting me back over to like kind of like talk about like race and identity. And this was before those conversations were really happening there. And I also started getting messages from a Black Irish community that I didn't even really know like existed, who were just like, oh, I've never seen any of this like written about before. And I think that was another turning point in my ongoing No. My relationship with Ireland is fully rehabilitated now, but it was a process of like rehabilitation.
I read that piece
Oh, did you?
years ago.
Yeah, it was like a long time ago.
Great question.
Yeah, such a good question. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for being here. I mean, it's fascinating to hear your conversation, and for me, it's I'm intrigued by you guys having that connection, but it's also hearing like the disconnect as well at times. Like for me, it's been hard being Black American, African American, that kind of gamble of like how do you identify, and due to slavery, like that's been erased, right? I mean, Hezekiah Lewis is my slave name, but at the same time, I'm proud of that name. But at the same time, it's like, well, where am I from, right? So I did the 23andMe. I do have some Irish in me, which is crazy. I had no idea. I had to pay an extra $100 to find out.
Welcome to the Irish American.
But but for me, I'm always just fascinated by just that sense of connection, because that's one thing for me what's been hard is really who am I, right? And I really trace myself back to Louisiana, and I go to Ghana, I go to the continent all the time, but I still don't feel like that's my home. And I've been told by folks there that, why do you call yourself African American? Like, you're Black American, you weren't born in Africa. So that disconnect is like, it's disheartening at times. And I'm trying to find ways to build that bridge, and we do it through film and, trying to figure out, ways to really reconnect and find that sense of identity, because I think that's a big problem with a lot of our younger folks is like we don't have that sense of identity. So I try to bring those stories back, especially for my kids and my family, but that's just one little ripple that we can do. But I don't know, it's really fascinating and really hearing like, yes, you guys know kind of a sense of like where you're from, but that same thing, it's like now you also are being like the only one, and it's like, wow, like, so hearing it from the reverse, like it's but I'm trying to figure out what are some ways that you think we can all bridge these stories and these conversations, because I think our young ones can really learn from this, and seeing how global, like seeing folks like you, I didn't see that growing up, not even understanding I had any Irish, connection, like, I think Ireland, I think white, but like seeing this and hearing you and hearing your voices, how are some ways that people can connect with you all? Not just with the books and things like that, because a lot of folks that from where I'm from not going to come to this academic conversations. Yeah. So how do you reach the masses of folks that don't have the opportunity to go to schools like a Villanova or private schools, and how do we reach those kids in those inner cities that I came from?
I mean, I guess I want to ask you a question, because it's sort of something I've been trying to think about and also organize with people around. Kind of what Emma was saying. There's even as Black people in America who often don't feel like this is really our home on some level, when you travel abroad, you're American. Right? It becomes clear. Or you go to Africa. I went to East Africa as a 23-year-old. I'm like, I'm home. They're like, what? Oh, yeah. So we have these sort of ideas of homelands and homes that we're actually not culturally shaped by in real terms. But I guess I have a question for you, because you just mentioned having Irish ancestry, and Skip Gates wrote a piece in the New York Times a few weeks ago about, we need a new language to talk about race, and basically saying we need to talk about it in terms of ancestry. His point being that, when he's big, he does the African American Lives, Finding Your Roots series on PBS. And, what mode of history making, storytelling he's engaging is genealogical research, but also using DNA to sort of fill in the holes that the Middle Passage created, where you can't identify where your ancestors came from because of the broken ties of slavery. So he's sort of marshaling DNA technology to sort of say, well, we can tell you now. We can look inside your genome. And that's how he finds out he has Irish ancestry. And in this piece, he says, look, and now through this genealogical sort of crowdsourcing, he's been able to identify the person, a biography, not just a genealogy. But I wonder, his argument is that this creates a way of marginalizing the idea of race, that we're all these like separate five groups of peoples in human life. Instead, emphasizing actually we're connected in ways that we don't fully understand. I guess I wonder about the power of that to sort of reframe these narratives about who belongs to whom and who belongs where and where is our true home. Even as I'm kind of skeptical about the ways that can go wrong. Further inscribing this idea that race is kind of biological. And specifically, I'm asking you this because I recently joined the board of an organization called the African American Irish Diaspora Network. And it's totally dedicated to connecting African Americans to Ireland and Irish Americans. And it's obviously in some ways appeals to perhaps a small demographic of people like me. But the hope is that maybe it appeals to something broader insofar as it creates a space to explore histories of people connected and often in conflict, but also in working through complicated histories, connecting people in real time, through engaging the history, say Frederick Douglass in Ireland and what he learned from Daniel O'Connell and the legacies of that history. I guess I wonder, as someone who, given the question you asked, what you think about those sorts of efforts.
I mean, the efforts sound amazing. I think for me, it's a matter of like, you use the Skip Gates, but a lot of times those are celebrities that he's talking to a lot, and these kids aren't going to be on that level, right? So when I'm looking at the sense of like, my target audience is those folks that I grew up with, where I came from. Like there was no sense of like these invisible borders or these taxes. Like you pay taxes around here, you're going to get a great school. Like these kids don't even have the resources. The Strawberry Mansion, we were there for many years, and they just don't have these resources. So I'm just trying to find a way to bring these conversations to them, because I think it starts with them having self-pride. Like they're just worried about when they're going to eat. They can't do up DNA and all these like 23andMe's, and they're not on that mindset. So it's like, for me, it's like engaging with folks and starting these conversations at the grassroots level. Like, they probably don't know who Skip Gates is. Like, they really are not watching PBS. So they're on Instagram. They're on, now Snapchat. I don't even know how to use all these things. So I'm running out of options to even communicate with them. But I think there's a sense of like pride in like seeing folks like you who are like, you sound, just through music, like what are some creative ways that we can engage? Because I think, yes, everything you're saying is right. It's true. And I think we can find these other ways to really have these, like, that defining what race is or where do you belong, because belonging to them is very important. The street you grew up, like when I grew up, I couldn't wear red. I would be killed walking across the park if I wore a certain color because I didn't belong in that hood or that street. So it was very defined on the West Coast. I'm from California, so on the West Coast, it was very defined by the music you listen to, the sign you said, the way you wave to somebody. Like, you can be murdered for like clothing, which was crazy, but that's their belonging. But I try to get them to think beyond that. And coming to the East Coast for me was a cultural shock. Being at Villanova University, I came here undergrad. I never seen as many white people in my life, and it was like I was shocked. But it was like I was so wrapped up in this bubble of survival. So it wasn't like they were thinking intellectually about constructs of race. They're thinking, how do you survive? Walking outside your door, so that's where we need to start from the ground roots. And like I said, I love this. The series I think is made, but it's not that they're not the target audience for that conversation.
So, like, I was having this conversation actually today with one of those German interviews that I was doing, because in the book What White People Can Do Next, I talk about like how everyone was saying like read all these like anti-racist titles to like to understand like how to be like a better white person. And I was like, well, if you're going to engage with like cultural production, there are things outside of like anti-racist books that have been written in the last 3 years that might be beneficial. And then as I was saying earlier today, I feel like I actually got like a lot of my political education from music. And even in that article that I was talking about, I'm Irish, but I'm not white. Why does that matter? I reference like a lot of Irish trad, like a lot of Irish folk songs. And I talk in that piece about how a lot of my like anti-colonial and anti-imperialist stance that expressed itself through kind of expressed itself more through kind of like a black consciousness, but it actually had a lot of it had its origins in me like being immersed in like rebel music, in Irish like revolutionary rebel music from a very young age. And that wasn't like some high culture music, that was just music that like everyone like was engaging with. And similarly, like I would have listened to like a lot of roots reggae growing up as well. And that music is like, again, it's just like it's like Pan-African, you know? So I think it's like a tragedy. I don't think it's an accident that music has become, that the music a lot of young people are consuming is so not only like depoliticized, but actually deals with themes that are not necessarily going to be helpful, you know? But I think music is really is a really powerful way of engaging.
We have someone who wants to comment on that.
Yes.
Okay.
To the gentleman in front of me, you have the best platform ever because you are proximate to those young people. Start those conversations by telling your story as much as you know about your own genealogy. Marry that, your own genealogy, marry that with what was going on in American history at that time. What was going on in world history when you were born? I've spent about 25 years doing my own genealogy. And you're right, when you travel abroad, you don't have to say anything, they say America. I'm not sure what it is, how we carry it.
You can tell.
Yeah,
I can tell them.
it
Anyway.
screams, it does scream. So start with your story. It has been my lived experience talking to young people, people of all ethnicities that I hang out with. When I tell my story, they are transfixed. They want to know more about world history at that time, or the geographic location in Wakefield, England, that I happened to find out my 8th great-grandmother was baptized. I went to that cathedral. Okay, I'm one of the lucky ones. They are transfixed that my maternal grandparents were sharecroppers, great-grandparents were sharecroppers. So start with you. Start with your story. Instagram cannot supersede your life story.
Thank you. Maybe that's a. Do you want? No, go ahead. I guess I want to echo that, and also acknowledge the difficulty of what you're describing. Jennifer had mentioned one of the things I spent a lot of time on in the last decade is prison education, and in some ways, the students we have they obviously already got caught. You know, but what they'll tell you about is really hard lives, an array of difficulties. But the chance to actually get to read, to engage ideas, to which they didn't have access to or took it for granted when they had it. Becomes a tremendous source of grounding, belonging in a cohort of students, source of pride and a sense of possibility. And I think, insofar as part of what, say, the genealogical story or the trajectory of you as a proximate figure to them, what's important about that is a sense of like, we all come from somewhere. We all owe our existence to that which came before. And in some way, talking about the ways that what we do now reflects that, I think that's powerful. It's obviously not a panacea, but but that sense of how did you do it becomes really important. And
I don't know. I just want to respond real fast, but yeah, this
We gotta get this Hezi on the mic.
I'm just really conflicted with that. You know what I mean? It's hard because, yes, I tell my story all the time. I do this all the time, right? And I'm conflicted because the gentleman sitting next to me, he's one of my students from years ago in my social justice doc class. We did a film called Sankofa. And we talked about the loss of black identity. The loss of black identity due to slavery and colonialism. They won an Oscar for that film. And for me, just 2 days ago, I got a message, and it just tore my heart apart. And this little boy that we highlighted in the film, I met him 5 years before. We did another film that was a finalist for the Oscar. It was about the loss of talking about the conflict of education, right? And he's now got arrested for like rape. And I feel like we lost, we literally, it was like a couple of years too late. And I mean, his story is unbelievable. When you watch the film, it's like, his perception of Africa was like, oh, they live in bandos and I want to help them. And the perception of God's way in Ghana was like, no, I need to help him. He's suffering mentally, right? And there's a sense of like that conversation between the two, and like now to see in reality, man, we worked so hard to share my story, to be in his space, to take him to these places, and my dream was to bring him to the continent, but he just couldn't. COVID destroyed all that, right? But now it's like he's done, So it's conflicting. It's hard because I wish these conversations can happen when they're so much younger. I got him in high school, kind of getting into, and it was a struggle. It's a struggle, and so I'm very conflicted at this point because it's so fresh, right? And I couldn't even speak for 2 days about it. This is my first time actually even talking about it in public, but it's just conflicting because when you watch that film, you see the beauty and the power that this young man has, but now he's done, and it's like, I don't know, it's hard. It's disheartening.
he's caught, but he's not done.
Yeah, I mean, but it's just in matter of this for me right now. It's just I don't know. It's really hard, but I'm trying to figure out other ways to really engage them with folks like you to have these deeper conversations where they don't have to pay to play. That's my whole thing, and I feel like that's what's destroying these kids. I have a 6-year-old. I have a 1-year-old. It costs my 6-year-old $26,000 a year to get out of a bad educated area. I don't have $26,000 a year. Luckily, I'm getting grants and things, but it's that's one of many, and it shouldn't be that way.
Right, and that's what's so obscene about the Jay-Z party. Right,
but then if you also think about so in England in the 1970s and 80s when the black community is now more recent African and West African immigrants, but in the 70s and 80s it was primarily Caribbean and Jamaican and other Caribbean islands that actually had Rastafarianism was huge and Pan-Africanism, and there was a lot of discrimination in schools against West Indian children. And so a response to that was the creation of these Saturday schools, where the community actually created these supplementary schools where the children got a Pan-African education. And then I also like read so much like about the Black Panthers and their actual organizing.
Yeah.
And they were able to just like, you know, sometimes you hear this, frequently you hear this idea that, you know, like reading is like, and especially reading things that are complex and like theoretical is like elite and people won't be into it and you can't engage people. Panthers were like out getting people reading like Nietzsche and like Socrates, and these were not privileged people with any, you know, access to particular, like with educational privileges, but they would, it was just that kind of strategic organizing that I feel is, see, I'm not saying it doesn't exist now, but it doesn't seem, the emphasis is not on it in the same way, because I feel so much of the anti-racism is from above and is corporate and is focused on other, on inclusion and representation.
Political theory is one of the most popular classes in the prison.
Yeah, that's, see?
They
Get it.
they understand it.
Well, thank you so much for that share, and for your responses, and for all of our audience members here. And if you could join me in thanking Emma Dabiri